I don't know exactly when I stopped recognizing myself. Maybe it was one of those mornings when I got up to prepare breakfast for people who didn't even say thank you. Or maybe it was one of the nights when I came home from work, exhausted, only to cook, clean, and still be criticized for not doing enough. I'm Lily. I'm 34 years old. And this is the story of how I walked away from a life that never truly belonged to me. My story begins long before I realized how unhappy I was. I grew up in a traditional home, in a small town, where the expectation was always clear. Be a good daughter, a good wife, and one day a good mother. I followed the path that was drawn for me, like a train on tracks I hadn't chosen. I went to college. I studied education because I loved teaching, but as soon as I graduated, I had to move back home to help my parents. That's when I met Lane. He seemed sweet, polite, and above all, interested in building a family. My parents approved, especially Ms. Marcy, my mother. She used to say that Lane was the kind of man you don't let slip away. And maybe to please her, or out of fear of disappointing them, I gave in. We got married in a simple ceremony, and soon after, I moved into his parents' house. That's where the nightmare really began. Lane lived with his parents, Mr. Charles and Ms. Elsa, and they made it very clear from the start that I would now be part of the team. That's how Ms. Elsa phrased it the first time she handed me a list of chores. I thought it was temporary, a kind of adaptation. But weeks went by, and I realized that my place in that house would always be the same, the one who served. Lane barely helped. He worked as a mechanic in his father's shop, came home covered in grease, and went straight to the shower and then the couch. Dinner needed to be ready, the clothes ironed, the dishes spotless. I tried to talk to him, to share how overwhelmed I felt. He would laugh and say, "You're just overreacting, Lily. My mom always did it all, and she never complained." And that was the standard they measured me against. Ms. Elsa, the matriarch who never complained. But I saw the sadness in her eyes, even if she tried to hide it. Her entire life had been spent serving her husband and children. And now me. It felt like a generational curse being passed down without consent. I still remember the first time I cried washing dishes. It had been a particularly rough day. My students had been difficult. I hadn't had lunch. And when I got home, there was a note on the fridge. "Lily, we're out of cleaning supplies. Go to the store after work." No please, no thank you. Just expectation. And I went. Of course I did. Because that's what I had become. The woman who always said yes. I wasn't living. I was surviving. In someone else's house. Fulfilling someone else's expectations. With a man who saw me more as a convenience than as a partner. And still I kept telling myself, it's just a phase. Things will get better. They have to. But they didn't. The weeks turned into months, and the months into years. My dreams slowly faded away, like old photographs left out in the sun. I barely recognized myself in the mirror anymore. I stopped wearing makeup, stopped doing my hair, stopped smiling. I was always tired, always stressed, always carrying the weight of a house that wasn't mine but depended entirely on me. Lane's affection began to dwindle. In the beginning, he would at least ask how my day went, or bring me a coffee after work. Now he barely acknowledged my presence. If I asked for help, he'd roll his eyes. If I got emotional, he'd say I was being dramatic. Once, when I was feeling sick and asked him to go to the pharmacy, he said, "Why don't you just walk? You're not bedridden, are you?" That moment burned into my memory, not because of the words, but because of the realization that came with them. I could disappear, and no one in that house would even notice. Ms. Elsa, meanwhile, had started using my presence as her crutch. She never asked how I was feeling, or if I needed anything. She would knock on our door at 6 a.m. to ask if I'd made coffee. She'd remind me of what was missing from the pantry, or what needed to be ironed. She never raised her voice, but there was always a passive-aggressive tone, a sigh, a sarcastic smile. I started waking up with anxiety in my chest, dreading the sound of her slippers approaching the door. Mr. Charles was mostly quiet. He didn't get involved, but I knew he supported the dynamic silently. When I once brought up to Lane that we should consider moving out, Mr. Charles said during dinner, in front of everyone, "You're lucky to live here, Lily. No rent, no bills. A woman like you should be grateful." Grateful. That word haunted me. As if I owed them something. As if my exhaustion was the price I had to pay for a roof over my head. Even though I worked full-time and contributed with groceries, cleaning supplies, and sometimes even with their medical bills. But gratitude, apparently, was a one-way street. The rare moments of peace came at school. My students, despite the chaos they sometimes brought, were my little sanctuary. Teaching gave me purpose. It reminded me that I could still make a difference in someone's life. Sometimes I'd linger after hours, helping a student with homework, or just cleaning the classroom slowly, just to delay going back to that house. But I was also lonely, isolated. I had lost touch with most of my friends. Lane never liked when I went out with them. He said things like, "You're not in college anymore," or "Why waste money on lunch with people who don't care about you?" And slowly I withdrew. I believed maybe he was right. Maybe no one did care. Maybe I had become invisible to the world. Until one afternoon, after a long parent-teacher conference, I stopped at a small cafe near the school. I needed to breathe. I ordered a cappuccino, sat at a corner table, and just watched people going about their lives. Laughing, talking free. That's when I heard a voice behind me. "Lily?" I turned around and there he was, Brian. We had gone to college together. We had even worked on a few projects side by side. He was always calm, the kind of guy who truly listened when you spoke. He smiled, genuinely happy to see me. And for the first time in a long time, someone looked at me like I mattered. We talked for a long time. About our careers, old classmates, dreams that had faded and others that had blossomed. He told me about how he had left our small town for a few years, worked in another state, and then returned to open a small art studio. I felt a flicker of something inside me. A warmth I hadn't felt in ages. When I told him I was still married, he hesitated for a second, then nodded respectfully. But I saw it in his eyes. He knew. He saw my sadness, even if I tried to hide it behind a smile. That brief encounter awakened something in me. A memory of who I once was. The Lily who used to dream of traveling, of writing, of creating, of loving. The Lily who believed she deserved more than just survival. And it scared me. Because once you remember who you are, it becomes unbearable to keep pretending you're someone else. That night, I got home later than usual. I told Lane the school meeting had gone long. He didn't even look up from his phone. Ms. Elsa made a passive remark about dinner being cold, and I just nodded, silently reheating a plate without saying a word. But something inside me had shifted. That conversation with Brian had stirred an old voice in me. A voice I had silenced for far too long. The days that followed were filled with a strange duality. I continued with my routines, cleaning, working, cooking, but I was no longer on autopilot. I had started journaling again, late at night when everyone was asleep. I wrote about how I felt, what I missed, who I used to be. I started remembering the little things that once made me happy. Rainy afternoons with a book, painting on Sundays, singing along to old songs. I began to reclaim tiny pieces of myself, piece by piece. But with that inner awakening came an unbearable contrast. Every time Lane ignored me or snapped at me, it hurt more. Every sigh from Ms. Elsa, every cold stare at the dinner table, every instance where I felt like a maid rather than a wife. It all became more vivid, more painful. I could no longer numb myself. I could no longer tell myself, it's not that bad. One morning, while folding laundry, I found a love note in one of Lane's pockets. It wasn't from me. My hands trembled. I stared at the handwriting, the lipstick stain. The way it ended with "Can't wait to see you again." My mind raced. I wanted to confront him, scream, cry, but I didn't. Not right away. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching that piece of paper like it held the key to my prison. And in a way it did. That note confirmed what my heart had known for a long time. Lane didn't love me. Maybe he never had. I was useful. I kept his house in order, took care of his parents, stayed quiet. I had stopped being a partner and had become a convenience. I took a deep breath and went to work that day as if nothing had happened. But something inside me had snapped. And once that snap happens, you can't go back. You start plotting. Not revenge, but freedom. That week, I reached out to Brian. Carefully, cautiously. I didn't tell him everything, but I said I had been thinking a lot since we met. He invited me to see his art studio. I went telling Lane I had extra school work. The studio was small, full of color and life. Everything my world was not. Brian painted people, streets, emotions. He asked if I still wrote, and I shook my head. Not in years, I said. But something in his expression encouraged me. He believed I still could. We started meeting regularly. Always in the afternoon. Always under the excuse of work. But it wasn't about romance, not at first. It was about safety. Connection. He listened. He saw me. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I began to imagine a life beyond the one I was trapped in. But guilt is a strange thing. It sneaks in like a whisper. One night, as I lay beside Lane, pretending to sleep, I wondered if I was becoming the villain. If I was betraying a vow. If I was wrong. But deep inside, I knew I had already been betrayed. I had been abandoned long before I ever looked outside for comfort. What I was doing wasn't betrayal. It was survival. Ms. Elsa, as always, seemed to sense the shift. She began to criticize me more. You've been coming home late. This meat is too dry. Why are you so quiet lately? Her tone grew sharper. Her stares colder. And then one night it happened. I came home to find my clothes in a box at the doorstep. Lane stood behind her, arms crossed. Mr. Charles watched from the sofa, pretending not to hear. She doesn't want you here anymore, Lane said simply. I felt my chest tighten. You're kicking me out? She feels disrespected, he said, not even using his own words. You're always out. You don't help like you used to. I laughed. A dry, bitter laugh. After everything I've done? Ms. Elsa snapped. Don't raise your voice in my house. That's when I realized it was never my home. It never had been. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. Instead, I picked up the box slowly, as if I were handling something sacred. My clothes, my memories, my silence, stuffed into cardboard like they meant nothing. And maybe to them, they really didn't. I looked at Lane one last time. His eyes were blank. There was no regret, no sadness. Just relief. Like someone removing a burden. I nodded slowly, turned around and walked away. I didn't have a plan. I had nowhere to go that night. But I had something more powerful than a plan. I had clarity. I called Brian from a payphone. He didn't ask questions. He came, helped me put the box in the trunk, and drove in silence. When we got to his place, I collapsed on the couch and finally let myself cry. It wasn't just about the house or Lane or Ms. Elsa. It was grief for the years I had lost. For the version of me that had died little by little. Brian didn't say much. He made tea. He covered me with a blanket. And for the first time in years I slept without fear. The next morning, I woke up to light streaming through the window and the smell of fresh coffee. I looked around the room. Walls filled with art, books stacked in corners, half-finished canvases leaning against the walls. It was messy, chaotic, alive. And it felt more like home than that house ever did. Brian offered me the spare room until I could figure things out. I accepted with hesitation, not because I didn't trust him, but because I didn't know how to live for myself anymore. Every decision I made for so long had been through the lens of someone else's needs. But freedom, even in its rawest form, is addictive. In the following weeks, I started reclaiming my life. I began working longer hours at the school, took on a small weekend job at a local bookstore, and even enrolled in a community writing workshop. I found myself writing late into the night again. Poems, thoughts, fragments of the woman I used to be. Brian, always nearby, never pressured me. He gave me space, but also presence. Slowly our connection deepened. Not just physically but emotionally. I found comfort in his voice, his encouragement, his quiet understanding of my pain. With him, I wasn't invisible. One day at the bookstore, a woman came in asking about a poetry book. We started chatting, and I mentioned I was in a writing group. She asked to read something I'd written. I hesitated but gave her a short piece. A week later, she called me back. She was an editor for a small local magazine. She wanted to publish my poem. It was the first time in years that I felt seen. Truly seen. Meanwhile, Lane never called. Not once. No apology. No explanation. Ms. Elsa sent a message through a mutual acquaintance, saying she hoped I'd learn from my mistakes. I didn't reply. I had nothing left to say to people who had never really cared about me as a person, only as a function. But not everything was easy. I still had nights filled with doubt. Guilt lingered like a shadow. What if I was being selfish? What if I had been the problem all along? And then one evening, while journaling, I remembered something I had once written in college. You don't owe anyone the version of you that makes them comfortable. I read those words over and over. That's when I truly began to let go. The months passed with the gentleness of someone healing. I wasn't rushing toward any finish line. I was walking slowly through the ruins of my old life, choosing which pieces to carry forward. Living with Brian became something natural, something effortless. He never tried to replace anything or fix me. He simply stood beside me, offering light where things had once been dark. One evening, while watching the rain fall against the windows, he turned to me and said, "Lily, have you ever thought about writing your story?" I laughed at first. Who would want to read about all that pain? But the idea stayed with me. Maybe, just maybe, there was someone out there. Another woman sitting in silence, doubting her worth, thinking she had to give and give until there was nothing left. And maybe my voice could reach her the way no one had reached me. I started writing my story piece by piece. It wasn't linear. It was messy. Some nights I cried. Some nights I smiled at memories I thought were lost forever. But each word was a piece of my freedom. Each sentence, a stitch mending the soul I had once believed was permanently torn. Brian read every page, encouraged every truth. He became the first person who celebrated not just what I created, but who I was while creating it. And then something unexpected happened. An email from a well-known blog that published women's personal essays and memoirs. A friend from the writing group had sent them one of my early drafts, without telling me. They wanted to feature it. I panicked. Sharing my truth with strangers? My shame, my scars, my vulnerability? But I said yes. The post went live on a Sunday morning. By afternoon, the comments were flooding in. Messages from women all over the country, some thanking me, others sharing their own stories. Many said they felt seen, less alone, more understood. That's when I realized my pain hadn't been for nothing. That my silence had been heavy not because it was weak, but because it was holding stories that needed to be told. Opportunities began to come. Invitations to speak, to write, to participate in panels about emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and rebuilding after leaving toxic environments. I was terrified, but I kept saying yes. And the more I spoke, the lighter I felt. Meanwhile, I saw Lane once. He was at a cafe near my new apartment. He looked older, heavier. He was with someone new. He didn't see me, but I watched him for a moment, wondering what I had ever seen in him. Then I remembered. I was a different person back then. Someone desperate to be loved, even if it meant disappearing. I turned and walked away. No hate, no bitterness, just closure. Ms. Elsa, on the other hand, still lingered like a ghost in certain memories. Sometimes I'd hear her voice in my head, criticizing my choices, doubting my strength. But now I had a new voice too. My own. And it was louder. The final turning point came when I was asked to give a talk at a women's shelter. I stood in front of a small group. Dozens of eyes watching me, some filled with tears, others hardened by survival. I told them everything. From the small humiliations to the big betrayals. I told them how I had forgotten myself. How I had relearned how to breathe, how to exist. And I ended with a truth I now knew with every part of me. You are not selfish for choosing peace over loyalty to those who harmed you. When I finished, there was silence. And then applause. Not loud, not wild, but real. A woman came up to me afterward. She was shaking. She said, "I thought I was crazy. But you just told my story." I hugged her. Because once I had needed that hug too. A few months later, something shifted inside me. Subtle at first, like the first warmth of spring after a long, merciless winter. I was no longer just surviving. I was dreaming again. Brian and I had grown into something solid. Strong not because it was perfect, but because it was real. We had long conversations about life, about pain, about art, about the kind of future we wanted. And one night, lying in bed with our hands intertwined, I told him something I hadn't said out loud in years. I think I want to be a mother one day. He looked at me with that calm gaze of his and said, "Then we'll build that future, Lily. When you're ready. On your terms." For the first time, I imagined raising a child in a home full of love, not fear, where their feelings would matter, where boundaries would be honored, where they'd see a mother who chose herself and taught them to do the same. Not long after that conversation, something inside me whispered that I should take a test. I didn't want to get my hopes up. I had conditioned myself not to expect too much from life. But when I saw the result, I just sat there staring. Pregnant. Pregnant. I laughed. Then cried. Then laughed again. I called Brian, and when I told him, he was silent for a second before whispering, "Lily, that's the most beautiful news I've ever heard." It felt like the final note in a symphony I had been composing without even realizing. Not an end, but a new beginning. Pregnancy wasn't easy. My body changed, and with it came old doubts. Would I be a good mother? Could I protect this new life from the pain I had once endured? But every time I felt that tiny flutter inside me, I was reminded of the woman I had become, of the courage it took to walk away, of the strength it took to start over, of the voice I had reclaimed. I began writing more, this time not about pain, but about rebirth. My story caught the attention of a publisher. They wanted to turn it into a book. It was called From Ending to Freedom, a journey back to myself. When it launched, the response was overwhelming. Women sent me letters, emails, messages. Book clubs invited me to speak. I was interviewed on podcasts. I was called brave, resilient, and inspiration. But none of those titles compared to the one that mattered most, whole. One morning, as I looked at myself in the mirror, 8 months pregnant, swollen feet, tired eyes, glowing in a way that had nothing to do with makeup, I smiled. I thought of Ms. Elsa, who once told me I'd be nothing without her son. I thought of Lane, who chipped away at my confidence until I could barely look in the mirror. And I thought of the younger version of me, the one who had believed she was only worthy if she was useful, if she was small, if she stayed quiet. To her I said silently, "Look at us now." Because healing doesn't erase the scars. It just changes what they mean. They became proof that I had lived, that I had fought, that I had won. The day I went into labor, I was scared. But when I held my baby for the first time, my daughter, I knew that everything I had endured had led me to that moment. She opened her eyes, and I swear, it felt like she saw my soul. I whispered to her, "You're safe. You're free. And you come from a line of women who chose to rise." I named her Hope, because that's what she was. And that's what I had become. Hope brought a new light into my world, a warmth I hadn't known since I was a child myself. Holding her, I often found myself lost in awe, wondering how someone so small could fill every corner of my heart. In those first few weeks I cried a lot, but not from sadness, no. From release, from gratitude, from the kind of love that cracks you open and rearranges your entire existence. I remembered my childhood and vowed she would never know the cold silence I had lived through. She would never have to earn love. It would meet her at the door, every day, without condition. Brian was beside me every step. The late-night diaper changes, the 3 a.m. feedings, the soft lullabies he sang off-key just to make Hope smile. Watching him with her healed parts of me, I hadn't realized were still tender. We weren't a perfect couple. We argued sometimes, we got tired, we made mistakes. But there was always respect. Always repair. That made all the difference. Hope grew fast, and so did my career. My book became a bestseller. I was invited to speak at women's conferences around the country. At first I hesitated. Who was I to stand on a stage and tell my story? But then I remembered all the women who had written to me. Women who had lived years, decades, under someone else's thumb. Women still trapped in emotional chains, thinking love meant sacrifice, silence, and pain. I spoke for them. I stood under those bright lights and said, "I am not a miracle. I am not extraordinary. I am simply a woman who said, 'Enough.' And I believe you can too." Each city I visited felt like a homecoming. I met women who brought their daughters, sisters, even their mothers to hear me speak. I saw tears, heard laughter, witnessed healing. One day backstage, a young woman approached me shaking. "My name's Erica," she said. "I just left a 10-year relationship where I lost myself completely. I read your book while sitting on the floor of a shelter. I'm starting over. Thank you." I hugged her tightly. No words. Just the understanding that passed between us like a lifeline. That night I cried again. But this time for Erica. For every Lily out there finding her way back to herself. Years passed. Hope started school. Her hair always wild, her imagination wilder. She'd paint for hours. And I'd hang every piece on our wall. She loved art like her mama. Ms. Elza tried to reconnect once. A letter in the mail. No apology. Just a few lines asking to meet her granddaughter. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't hate her. I had made peace with the past. But peace doesn't mean access. I never responded, because protecting Hope also meant protecting the sanctuary I had built around her. One afternoon, sitting on the porch, Hope crawled onto my lap with a drawing. "This is you, Mommy," she said. "And this is me. And we're flying." I looked at the drawing. 2 stick figures with wings, soaring above clouds. "We're flying?" I asked. "Yeah," she said. "Because you taught me we don't have to stay on the ground if it hurts. We can always fly." And just like that I knew. I had broken the cycle. I hadn't just survived. I had rewritten the story. So if you're watching this and you feel stuck, forgotten, erased, let me tell you. You are not too late. You are not too broken. And you are never, ever beyond saving. Your story is still being written. Pick up the pen. And write the chapter where you rise.